politicians of a different era, if you will, Joe, and I do wonder about our way forward and American politics.
Well, I guess, that's why I mentioned, considering a president saying that we would not seek to dominate or dictate to others as the next president prepares to take over a sovereign nation. Manifest destiny is back on the menu here, and that was a very different world, of course, when you're talking about Jimmy Carter here, who's also remembered for the Camp David Accords. He was not a stranger to geopolitics, and that's an agreement that stands to this day. Controversial comments when it came to Israel toward the later end of his life. He compared the situation in Gaza to apartheid. He wasn't afraid to speak the truth, but it was just delivered in a very, very different way.
Hey, Joe, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other big story that we're following today, which are the devastating wildfires out in Southern California. We just spoke to Sarah McGregor, longtime resident of LA, out in the Los Angeles Bureau, who shared with us what she's been going through over the last 48 hours. The federal response here. This afternoon, President Biden set to meet with senior White House and administration officials for a briefing. We're going to hear from the president a little later. What power does the federal government have to help battle these wildfires? What can it do?
Well, it's a good question here. The line from the White House and what we heard from Karine Jean-Pierre as the president now has canceled his trip to Italy, by the way. He was supposed to be on his way to Rome following Jimmy Carter's funeral to focus, as they said, on the federal response to the wildfires. He was actually in California just yesterday, met with first responders there, got a briefing. He was with the governor, Gavin Newsom. But guys, we're talking about, authorities on a number of different levels, from state to local, but yes, also federal. As we have now heard, the Pentagon apparently is getting involved. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, announcing from Germany that the Pentagon will be offering material and manpower to this situation where it is so badly needed. And that is all unlocked, of course, by the president. This is the executive, the federal response to what we're seeing right now. And look, the images here are something that all of Americans are sharing. They're horrifying. And at a time like this, the president needs to address the American people, and apparently he will do that. We've heard he'll talk a couple of hours from now. We'll, of course, bring that to you live here on Bloomberg at just a precarious time for the city of Los Angeles and the state of California.
Hey, Joe, final question. I am curious, once again, as we continue to see and assess the impact of climate change, and of course, we're going to figure out exactly what caused these wildfires, but look around the globe and we continue to see the pressures and the impact of such. Does something like this move it up in terms of the members of Congress or even this incoming administration, the importance of climate change and initiatives to stem it or stop it?
I can only answer honestly, and I would say probably not any more than we have already seen. This is an issue that has really seemed to have fallen largely along party lines, and you've got an incoming president here who has called climate change a hoax. So I don't know that this situation is going to change moods there. Donald Trump has blamed essentially Gavin Newsom for what's happening here, suggesting that he's somehow restricting water to the Los Angeles area, and the governor's office says that is completely untrue. Whether it moves the needle on climate change, the most recent conversation we're having about that in Washington is about Republican efforts to undo components of the IRA, some of which are geared at climate change. So I'm not sure this changes the tune there, and I don't mean to sound like the guy in Washington, but this is something that is difficult to move the needle on here.
Joe, disaster recovery aid, federal aid for the state, how does it complicate things that the U.S. is undergoing a transition in administrations in less than 2 weeks?
Well, it's a great question, and not just that, but also a debate that's about to begin. We run out of money on the federal level here in March. They need a budget, and there's going to be, you better believe, a pretty sizable supplemental emergency budget request that comes either from this administration before Joe Biden is done or from Donald Trump once he's in office after the 20th. The impact on the insurance industry is something as well that the Congress, the federal government, may actually need to get involved in here. This is a response that's going to take a long time. But yes, it will complicate the budget conversation as we also try to include the debt ceiling, extending the Trump tax cuts. These are all going to be part of potentially the same legislation.
All right, Joe, thank you so much. Super appreciate that. Co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power coming back at you at 5 p.m. Wall Street time. That is, of course, Joe Matthew there in D.C. We want to stay with actually the fires. Looking at one of our latest updates here on the Bloomberg, the deadly fires in L.A. forcing tens of thousands more residents from their homes as firefighters struggle to bring the blazes under control. Almost 180,000 people, Tim, are under evacuation orders. This is from the L.A. County Sheriff at a briefing today. That's up from more than 100,000 the day before. for the death toll, standing at 5 as of yesterday. But again, the LA County Sheriff saying it would take time to compile a final count, given the massive scale of the destruction. And the fires are still not under control.
Yeah, I'm looking at the CAL FIRE website right now. 92 wildfires have burned 29,053 acres, 5 fatalities as of now. In Los Angeles County, our live blog pointing out the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire continue to be out of control, while that Hearst fire is 10% contained, and the fire in Runyon Canyon is currently out of control. Joining us now with more is Will Wade, power and renewable energy reporter. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Will, you write about power, you write about renewable energy, the connection to climate. What do you think about when you see a situation like this unfold in Los Angeles? What's top of mind for you?
Well, what's top of mind is that it's just a huge tragedy, and we're going to see more of these. I mean, look, I grew up partly in Southern California. I grew up partly in Pasadena. I know this area. I know those winds every fall. They'd start coming in from the east, and you'd smell smoke when the hills catch on fire. That's just normal. But let me hit you with the number, 78, okay? I just saw this stat today. There are 78 more fire days in California these days than there were 50 years ago.
What's a fire day?
A day when there's a big wildfire burning.
So it's a fire the size of something that actually
Something big enough to get measured and noticed and cause problems.
So make the connection for us. What does that mean? Why is that?
It's a climate change thing. This is comparing, how dry the hills get. I mean, in California, it mostly rains in the winter, and then over the course of the summer, the hills get baked dry. It's nothing but tinder and fuel for fires. Once they start, they get really out of control. But now it's hotter, it's drier, there's less rain, so there's more fuel. Once it starts, they're hard to bring in under control.
I mean, well, that's the point, right? That in other words, we'll find out ultimately what started or caused this fire, but the underlying conditions of the dryness, right, and just make it ripe for these intense and very destructive fires, and that's the result of climate change.
That's exactly right.
So, it's interesting, we're kind of this meld, if you will, of politics as we honor and remember former President Jimmy Carter and thinking about his policies and him talking about, the environment in the late 70s and the importance of it. And here we are watching these fires out on the West Coast. We have a lot of conversations with you. What again is the narrative as we get ready for a change in the White House, and we're talking policy, and Joe Matthews saying not likely that that's going to be a priority in terms of climate change initiatives. Is there any interesting narratives that kind of give you hope that things can get better or at least slow down?
I'm really concerned that the new administration is going to not be supportive of climate policies. Certainly, we have no evidence that Trump is a supporter of climate policies. As he comes in, he could throw the brakes on policies, he could reverse some policies. It's going to be turbulent.
What about the business environment and business leaders and other leaders who either, a lot of times we take our cues from what's going on in Europe in terms of products and safety and so on and so forth, or even social media or something like that, but a business that might be in California and has to think about fires, that they maybe more embrace greener alternatives because they understand that it kind of has to do with the existence of their own business and their future.
Certainly we saw that in the first Trump
Which was supposed to be ESG, I think, kind of the whole idea of it, but we'll put that on the side for now. But do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, in the first Trump administration, even as Washington was not being a leader in climate policy, a lot of states and cities were taking the initiative, and a lot of businesses were definitely enacting green policies because they could see that it was in their financial interests to try and curb carbon emissions. And it wasn't just for the optics and the politics of saying we're a green company. It's because they could see how it affected their business.
A state like California, 5th largest economy in the world, it has the power to do that. But can states do this stuff without help from the federal government if an administration doesn't want to actually do those things?
States have the power. States have their own decisions that they can make.
Do they have the money? Do they have the funds? Do they have the resources to do it? It's a challenge.
It is a challenge. It is. I'm right now, I'm looking at New York State, which in 2019 enacted one of the most ambitious climate policies in the nation, and now we're taking stock, and it's not clear if they're going to make those goals. So states have power, but it's not easy. And certainly, like in the past, we've been talking the past year and a half here about inflation making everything more expensive. And all of a sudden, these green goals are more costly, and people are becoming more concerned about that.
I just want to mention from the live blog that's tracking the LA wildfires, Mayor Karen Bass saying, thanks to the bravery and collaboration of the LA Fire Department, the Sunset Fire is fully contained. She is messaging her citizens, if you're returning home, please drive slowly, watch the road. Firefighters are still working in some damaged areas, and we know that that is continuing. Just back to kind of alternative energy, we talk about AI, generative AI, all of the power that's needed for that. Joe Biden's administration, President Joe Biden's administration, we got a story a couple of days ago looking to push for geothermal as a key energy source. Any of you chuckle, any of these energy, I mean, any of it, or nuclear, all of this is going to take time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like geothermal. I'm a fan of geothermal. Traditionally, you can only do it in certain parts of the world.
Iceland does a lot of it, right?
You have to be in an area that has a lot of geothermal activity. There's actually a big spot called the Geysers in Central California. There's a push for like the new kind of geothermal where you dig down until you can top the hot rocks. So there's some promise there. I think we'll see more geothermal, but I don't know that it's going to be big enough to be a massive mainstream thing. But it's just, one of many options.
Of the alternatives, just 20 seconds, of the alternatives you look at each and every day, which one is the most promising?
I'm a big fan of nuclear. I'm always writing about nuclear.
But that's going to take time too.
It's very slow. That's a problem. And fusion, but things take time.
Sorry, Carol, we don't have time to talk about nuclear waste, which is Carol's favorite topic when we talk about nuclear.
Yeah, nobody wants to talk about that.
She always keeps us real with nuclear.
Just going to say, Will Wade, thank you. Always. Will Wade, of course, our power and renewable energy editor. So appreciate getting his input. Continuing to track the fire. 5 people have died. More than 29,000 acres have burned. We'll continue to keep you updated on that and continuing to think about former President Jimmy Carter on this Thursday. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovec. A lot going on this Thursday, January 9th. You know the stock market is closed. The bond market closed at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. We have a guest that has seen a lot of different market and economic cycles under several different administrations. So we're kind of tying our world together here. Louis Navellier is chairman and founder at Navellier and Associates. He joins us from Florida. Louis, it is good to have you here. I'm trying to think where I want to start because it feels like, you know, we're thinking a lot about the U.S. as a country, about leadership because of the state funeral of former President Jimmy Carter. And I kind of want to start there. I think you got your undergrad in business administration in 78, your MBA in finance in 79. Take us back. What do you think about that time and era and what it was like to be a leader, a president at that moment?
Oh, it was super difficult. I actually worked for the Federal Home Loan Bank in San Francisco at the time, and we had this inverted yield curve and a banking failure. And of course, we had Paul Volcker, and they were experimenting with monetization and all that stuff. But it was really hard for Jimmy Carter because we had rampant inflation, and he was still fighting that. You know, prior to Carter, we had the Nixon price controls, and that really hurt him. The stock market went up in his 4-year term, went up, I think, almost 45%, but net of inflation, it lost ground. So he didn't have the most spectacular economic oversight, but a lot of it was just luck, you know. I mean, it's
yeah.
The poor guy, you know, he's obviously was a wonderful person. And then, you know, I still remember when he addressed the nation, we had an energy crisis and we had high energy prices. He was wearing a sweater because he was telling us we need to turn our thermostat down. And I think at that time the view of the world was more static. And then obviously Ronald Reagan became the next president. He was more upbeat. And we're kind of in a similar situation now. We got to defeat the inflation that reappeared, probably was mostly stimulus related. And then once we defeat the inflation, we got to be more upbeat and try to grow, versus look at us as a static economy.
You know, it's interesting. First of all, I was telling my daughter to put a sweater on either too. I'm like, I'm not kicking up the heat anymore. Like, it's cold out. Like, put a sweater on. One thing I want to stick with, though, is the appointment of Paul Volcker as chairman of the Fed, someone who we look back as an iconic Fed chair at this moment in time and kind of goes down in history. On that, Stuart Eizenstat, President Carter's domestic policy advisor, gave an eulogy this morning at the Washington National Cathedral, and he commented on that difficult decision of appointing Volcker.
Over the objection of all of his advisors, he chose Paul Volcker to lead the Federal Reserve, knowing in advance that Volcker's tough monetary policy would raise interest rates and unemployment because Paul told him that, and would do so in a presidential election year. You take care of the economy, Paul. I'll take care of the politics.
That, of course, is Stuart Eizenstat this morning from the Washington National Cathedral giving a eulogy. Stuart Eizenstat, President Carter's former domestic policy advisor. Hey, Louis, we're talking with Louis Navellier. The importance of putting someone in place who would do some hard stuff. Paul Volcker did. He raised rates with the political costs to then President Jimmy Carter. You know, I think about the time we are in right now, or even what we've seen from Jay Powell. I mean, the importance of that independent Fed doing what's necessary when it comes to monetary policy and ensuring a stable economy. It's important, super important. How do you think about it in today's day and time?
Well, first of all, our Fed is not going to do what Volcker did. I mean, Volcker went from 20% to 8.5%. back up to 20% in 1 year. And I still remember there was a home builder in front of Congress asking for Volcker's head on a platter. So the good news, it broke inflation. The bad news is it came at a horrible cost to the economy. So we're obviously in much better shape right now. I think obviously the Fed's going to continue to cut. I personally think they're going to cut 4 times because rates are going to be collapsing in Europe, and we're going to have this global rate crash. in 2025. We already see it in China. China's bond yields are lower than Japan. And it looks like China is going to be the new Japan for the next couple decades. And it's demographically driven. It's hard to grow your economy when you're shrinking in population. And that's not only China, that's all Europe and much of the rest of the world.
Is that
so we're
is that
in
also
better shape.
is that also a risk to the U.S. with a crackdown on immigration?
Well, I don't think they'll deport people that have jobs. I can't imagine they'll do that. Obviously, they want to deport criminals and gang members and all that stuff. But I think if you have a job in America, it's going to be very hard to be deported unless you committed some sort of crime. So it's just, I just can't imagine. You know, the Tyson foods, the Hormel foods, they get a lot of the illegals and they make them legal. You know, they work for them. They process their paperwork and all. So I just can't imagine they would do that because Trump would do that because it would make chicken prices go up. We already have chicken prices up because of bird flu out west. We don't need to have more chicken inflation.
No,
Hey,
really.
I do own 2 egg companies though, so I'm very happy. One I already announced.
Cal-Maine, one of them?
Yep,
Okay.
yeah, and Vital Farms is the next one. That's organic eggs in Austin, Texas. So if you want your chickens to live a happier life, order their eggs, but they're more money.
I do, but I have to take a mortgage out to buy eggs right now. I'm just going to put that out there. I mean, how are you looking at today's market environment? I think we're trying to figure out, I think there's a lot of questions about what ultimately we heard on the campaign trail from Donald Trump, the president-elect, you know, how much comes to fruition and what it means in terms of tariffs, taxes, you know, regulatory, and so on. I don't know. Do you feel like your crystal ball is clear for 2025?
Yeah, I do. I think Trump is very simple. He just likes to win, and he likes to put you in an uncomfortable position when he negotiates. But I think he'll be making a deal with everybody. And I don't think we're going to have 25% tariffs on Mexico or Canada because they will be doing what Trump wants. They have to. He might tinker with NAFTA a little. You know, BYD moves to Monterrey, Mexico, and tries to import cars. I think, yeah, he'll probably mess with that. I'm sure that most of the tariffs will be on China. As far as Europe's concerned, yeah, they put higher tariffs on us than we do on them, so they'll be making a deal there. Whether it'll be LNG or us putting higher tariffs on them, we'll find out.
But Louis, one place you think that he will not actually follow through is when it comes to immigration. Why do you think he'll do all this other stuff that he said he'd do, but he won't do that?
It's just impractical. It's expensive, and it would hurt the economy. So I think...
Would that hurt him politically not to do it because the expectation is there?
I don't think anybody expects someone with a job to be deported, okay? So obviously you got to wait 5 months to get a job, but once you get a job, I would be shocked if he deports you, unless you committed a crime or have a bad rap sheet, you know. But it's logistically very expensive to deport everybody, and I think they might deport 600,000-800,000 people, but after that, it'll probably slow down.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Hey, Louis, thank you so much. So appreciate your thoughts and really just looking back to during the Carter administration, giving us some really smart perspective. Louis Navalier, chairman and founder at Navalier and Associates. All right, so that is certainly some of the market focus and just kind of big picture think. We do want to get back to what's happening on the West Coast. 5 people have died and more than 29,000 acres have burned. Biggest blazes in the Pacific Palisades, Pasadena remain uncontrolled, although we did just get an update from the mayor that the Sunset Fire is fully contained. So we want to get an update from our Mark Chediak. He's Bloomberg Power reporter. Mark, what are you hearing? What's the latest you're hearing about what's happening there on the West Coast?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So you summed it up pretty well. There are two major fires still burning pretty much out of control. The Palisades Fire, which ripped through the Pacific Palisades, and authorities said that fire has torched thousands of structures, although they are still doing assessments now. And then there is the Eaton Fire, which burned through Altadena and Pasadena. And that fire has burned more than 1,000 structures, and they're also doing damage assessment there. The sheriff's office said that they expect the death toll to rise from these fires, but they are being very cautious in the way they go about determining these fatalities, some of these areas look like bomb had gone off, according to the sheriff's office. And so they're sending out their homicide teams actually and dogs to identify victims.
Hey, Mark, you're up there in San Francisco. I do want to give an update to the folks out there from our retail team. Jaewon Kang writing on the live blog that Target said it's fast-tracking critical supplies to stores in surrounding areas. Kroger said that it lost a store in the Palisades due to the fires, but all employees were safely evacuated from a location. Albertsons said that it has evacuated 2 of its grocery stores in the area and they are undamaged, but all employees at the locations are accounted for. When I look at the CAL FIRE map, the concentration of these is really in Los Angeles County in terms of fires throughout the state. But in an environment such as this, is the entire state on guard?
That's a great question. And the answer is actually no. Northern California has actually gotten, where I am, we've actually gotten a lot of rain this winter. And so the fire risk is quite low here, fortunately. But in Southern California, they haven't had any like measurable precipitation for like 8 months. So the fire risk there is quite high, obviously. And what you saw happen earlier this week is there was a big windstorm event, and given that the conditions were so dry, it was just very, very vulnerable for these sort of kind of fires to break out.
What are you hearing too about containment? You know, we continue to hear the Palisade fire out of control, Eaton fire still out of control. I mean, the LA, you know, we're getting some updates from the fire, you know, from the fire officials. I'm just curious. I go back to what's expected in terms of weather over the next day or so, and whether or not that's going to help or hinder or exacerbate the situation.
Yeah, so the officials are hopeful that, you know, the winds have died down a bit, so they're hopeful that they'll be able to get some containment on these fires. They can now use aircraft, helicopters to dump water and fire retardant on the flames, and that will help a lot. It sounded like they are still concerned about the Palisades fire. They said wind gusts there were up to 60 miles per hour today. And so that one seems a little dicier. They seem to say that they had stopped some forward progress on the Eaton fire, which is good news, but they are still battling that fire neighborhood to neighborhood. So it's still kind of touch and go. I think the hope is, like I said, with the winds calming down a bit, that they can start at least establishing a firm perimeter around these fires.
All right. And just 15 seconds, Mark, do we know anything about the cause? I know Edison International, we saw stocks getting hit yesterday on this first day of the fire, but just very quickly, 10 seconds, anything that we know about what the cause is?
No, authorities say that they are investigating the cause of these fires, and nothing has been determined yet.
All right, understandable with so much going on and just trying to get them contained at this point and put out. Mark Chediak, thank you so much. Bloomberg News power reporter joining us from San Francisco. This is Bloomberg Business Week on TV and radio.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Thursday, January 9th. Of course, earlier today, the state funeral of former President Jimmy Carter at the Washington National Cathedral in the nation's capital. Right now, we have seen the plane has stopped and landed, and the Carter family, along with the casket carrying the former president, they have made their way off the plane, and they are at Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Benning, Georgia. They are soon going to depart for Plains, Georgia, and the Maranatha Baptist Church, where there will be a ceremony and a private funeral that will take place.
After that, a motorcade will go from the Baptist Church to the Carter residence in Plains, Georgia. And later, there will be a ceremony for an internment at the Carter residence. And later tonight, that internment will be complete, where the former president will be buried next to his wife of so many years, Rosalind Carter.
But once again, you can see the family members there, of course, coming off the plane, again, just arriving from the nation's capital, and we will soon see the casket carrying the body of the former president coming off as well.
This arrival ceremony is set to last roughly 30 minutes.
And we will continue, of course, to monitor it. As we said, a lot of what we happened earlier today, the state funeral, a lot of ceremony, a lot of former presidents and officials, a very public remembrance, if you will, of the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. What we will see now is a lot much more personal and private, and we will not actually see a lot of what will happen in terms of the private funeral service, as again at the Maranatha Baptist Church. That was where the former president taught Sunday school for many, many years. And again, there'll be a private internment next to his wife of many years, Rosalind Carter. So again, unlike some presidents who might have chosen to be, buried possibly in the nation's capital, and he again was a member of the Navy, the U.S. Navy, he has chosen to really come back home to his roots and back to his home.
Well, we've touched a lot on President Carter's legacies, various legacies, his economic legacy, the markets during his term, what he did after he was president with the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, Los Angeles. We've touched on the markets and so much more. For his foreign policy legacy, we bring in Dr. Nancy Mitchell. She's a Carter historian, a professor at North Carolina State University. She's the author of the award-winning 2016 book, Jimmy Carter in Africa, Race and the Cold War. She joins us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Mitchell, your book focuses on foreign policy in Africa at the height of the Cold War. On its surface, a pure play foreign policy issue. That's what it looks like. But you argue that the Cold War was bound to racial justice in the U.S., and that's really what President Carter had to navigate. Take us back to the time and give us the connection.
Hi, it's nice to be here. It's a complicated story, and it's a story that a lot of Americans really either have forgotten or didn't even know was happening at the time. But Carter told me, and also said publicly in 2 conferences that I attended, that he spent more time on Rhodesia, Zimbabwe than he did on the Middle East. So I think it's an important part of his legacy. It's a story of a war that didn't broaden, that didn't happen. And so it's not as flashy as wars that actually break out, but I think it's just as important and more admirable. There was, when Carter became president, of course, it was a very turbulent time with Vietnam and Watergate. But the heart of the Cold War in 1976, 1977 was in Africa. And the main reason for that was the decolonization of Angola, where 40,000 Cuban troops landed in Angola to support the government there. And the fear when Carter came in 77, and you had these 40,000 Cubans in Angola, was that the Cubans might move into Rhodesia to support the guerrillas, or you might call freedom fighters, who were fighting against the racist government of Ian Smith in Rhodesia. Carter spent a great deal of energy, time, and political capital trying to negotiate a peace settlement in Rhodesia to try to prevent that really impossible situation for the United States if the Cubans had intervened to support the African freedom fighters who were fighting against Ian Smith, because Carter couldn't have supported a racist government like Ian Smith's, and he couldn't have supported the Cubans. So the Cubans were backed by the Soviet Union. So it was a very complicated situation, and Carter spent a lot of energy on it.
Yeah, go ahead, Carol. You mentioned your conversations with the former president in the writing of your book, the interviews you did with him. You got to know him. I'm curious about the person you got to know, what you learned about him, and your experience with him.
Well, I don't know, I don't want to pretend I got to know him well, but he certainly made a really strong impression on me. I not only interviewed him, but I took several groups of students down to do research in the Carter Library and then down to Plains to see him teaching Sunday school, which I did several times. He really, when I was in his presence, his spirituality, his faith, just sort of emanated from him. And that's not a sentence that I say very often. But he really was clearly deeply spiritual and a man of courage. He could, he took very unpopular stances and stuck to them. And he could be quite stubborn. But he was extremely gracious. He was a very good listener. My experience of him was he was very smart and very accurate. Most people's memories when you interview them about the past are not completely accurate, especially in terms of the sequence of events. And President Carter was remarkably accurate in his recollection of what happened.
And we do want to point out, for those who are watching on Bloomberg Television and on YouTube and our streaming service, those who are listening on radio, the presidential casket of former President Jimmy Carter has been taken off the plane at Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Benning, Georgia. He is surrounded by his family and friends and loved ones. The casket being put into the hearse. They are on their way back to Plains, Georgia, specifically to the Marantha Baptist Church. He is expected to pass by his home in Plains, Georgia as well. Really, again, completing what has been a long week of memories and honor and remembrance, specifically of the 39th President of the United States, that started in Plains, Georgia, and has made its way to the U.S. Capitol, I should say, and again, a state funeral this morning, but finding its way once again back home on this Thursday, January 9th.
Dr. Mitchell, the former president remembered certainly for the hostage crisis in Iran, also the Middle East peace deal that he brokered at Camp David. What do you believe his foreign policy legacy should be?
I hope that it's not just a kind of soft, like, oh, he was a good man, but that it's actually a serious study of how he used the power of negotiation. The most famous is clearly Camp David, but he also, it's interesting to see how he used negotiation in the Panama Canal treaties and also in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. That more than any president I've studied, he really believed in trying to diffuse conflict before it happened. And you see that in those three main cases. In a one-term presidency with a lot happening, that's a remarkable record. And I would like to think that people will go back and value what didn't happen, what he prevented from happening, a broader war in Central America, a broader war in the Middle East, a broader war in Africa. It's not as flashy as war, but I think it's a much more admirable.
You know, it's interesting just having these conversations. So much has been said about his life after he left the White House, but in having these conversations, you realize how much he either did that avoided some very serious situations during his time there on Pennsylvania Avenue. Dr. Nancy Mitchell, thank you so much. Carter historian, professor at North Carolina State University. Her book, Jimmy Carter in Africa. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar, Tim Stenivek, live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. We are on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. And again, just looking at our live blog here, Justin Trudeau putting out a tweet on X. Canada mobilizing to help fight the wildfires in Southern California. Canadian water bombers are already in action. 250 firefighters are ready to deploy, and the Canadian forces are standing by to move personnel and equipment. He says to our American neighbors, Canada is here to help.
With the latest, we got David Baker, Bloomberg energy and climate reporter, joining us this afternoon. 5 people have died, more than 29,000 acres have burned. David, you're out there in Northern California. What are you hearing from the latest on the ground from our colleagues and from your sources in Los Angeles?
Well, there is actually some good news to report, some reason for hope here. We have seen the authorities this morning report that one of the biggest fires burning right now, the one that is burning right above Pasadena, the Eaton fire, did not grow overnight. It is not contained, but it didn't grow overnight, and that's actually quite good news considering it has destroyed entire neighborhoods at the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. We also have another fire north of the city, the Lydia fire, that has some containment, about 40% containment. And firefighters were able to stop a fire that popped up last night in the Hollywood Hills and briefly caused evacuations. Now, that said, we do have a very active situation. The winds are still very strong. We could still see other fires popping up today and tomorrow. It's still possible.
David, what do we know? And this is something that we've talked about with you a lot within the last 24 hours or so, and some of your colleagues and our colleagues, about the access to, what is needed to fight these fires. Winds coming down make it possible for planes to get up in the air or helicopters to get up in the air. We've talked about kind of some of the concerns around, access to water. But in general, are we hearing that the firefighters and the emergency teams have the resources that they need to continue to fight this and hopefully put it out sooner rather than later?
The water issue continues to be a problem, and that seems to be an infrastructure problem where the system simply isn't designed, at least the way it is right now, to move all the water that they need. These are very broad fire lines stretching for miles, and you have firefighters across those fire lines trying to tap into hydrants, and that's putting a strain on the system that just wasn't designed to move that much water. That said, they are getting water to these fires in multiple ways. They're using airdropping tankers, airplanes. They're using mobile carriers, mobile tanks, essentially, to augment the supplies in the areas where the hydrants have been running a little bit low. So they do have things like that coming in. They also have a lot of people coming in. You mentioned the promise from Canada to send people. They're already drawing firefighters and crews from all across California. I know here in San Francisco, where I'm based, the fire department here has sent people down there to fight the fires, since we're fairly safe right now because of all the rain that we've had recently. So they are pulling manpower in from other areas as well.
David, just in the last minute that we have with you, when we see reports of new fires cropping up in the area, are these fires that are caused by sparks coming from the wildfires that are raging right now? Are these new wildfires that have unknown causes? What do we know about how these have started?
We don't know a specific cause for any one of the fires that have popped up so far this week. And at this point, with a lot of the smaller fires that you see popping up, it's a pretty good bet that they may be coming from sparks from embers that are drifting off these other fires, blown by the wind. That always happens when you've got a big windstorm like we've had in LA this week. But so far, there has not been a single fire this week that we know an actual specific cause for. We just know what's fanning them, the wind.
All right. Well, certainly something we continue to track. David, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. David Baker, Bloomberg energy and climate reporter, joining us with the latest on the LA wildfires. He's out there on the West Coast. One other thing I'm seeing from our live blog, it says as the Eaton fire, though, has spread, local TV stations have been warning that their broadcast antennas on Mount Wilson are in peril and they could go off the air. Of course, reminding viewers they could stream so that they can stay informed and stay up to date. But just another thing, an aspect of this. All right, this is Bloomberg.
This This is Bloomberg Business Week, insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Thursday, January 9th, 2025. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenivek. We are live in New York City at Bloomberg headquarters in New York. Our focus, though, has really been on the East and West Coasts as we speak. First of all, of course, we have been remembering the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, the plane carrying his family and also the casket of his body has landed in Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Benning, Georgia. We have seen the casket being loaded into the hearse, and they are making their way to the Maranatha Baptist Church, where President Carter, former President Carter, taught Sunday school for many years. A private funeral service will take place there, and a little bit later on, there will also be a private interment. At the meantime, what you're seeing is an honor guard following all of those activities. So again, another stage of what's been a very long day, a long week, but all of it, of course, rightfully so in terms of honoring and remembering former President Jimmy Carter.
Well, as his grandson, Jason Carter, noted at his state funeral today, Jimmy Carter may have spent 4 years in the White House, 4 years in the governor's mansion, but he spent the other 92 years in Plains, Georgia, and that's where he is heading later today. Brett Pulley is Bloomberg Atlanta bureau chief. He joins us from our Atlanta bureau. Brett, as I mentioned, later today, the former president will be buried alongside his wife outside of their longtime home in Plains, Georgia. Plains, Georgia, about 150 miles from where you are in Atlanta. What can you tell us about this small town where Jimmy Carter spent most of his life?
Well, Tim, you're right. Plains is absolutely a small town. It's about 550 people. That was the population during the last census, and it's about 150 miles south of Atlanta in Sumter County, and it really is where Jimmy Carter spent much of his post-presidential years. He also spent time in Atlanta, where the Carter Center is located, and he had an office and an apartment there, and also spent time in a North Georgia cabin, sort of refuge, where the former president was known to have written many books and spent time fly fishing. So, you know, really since the moment about 5 or 6 days ago when the casket first emerged from the medical center outside of Plains to begin its journey, I have to tell you, people here in Georgia have really come out and paid homage and paid respect to this guy who is, you know, very much a native son, one of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I believe it was his grandson, you know, who said, listen, you know, he was 4 years in the White House, and of course, rightfully so, marking that, remembering it today and really throughout the week, and, you know, since we learned of his passing. But he reminded everybody that, 92 years or 98 years, let me do the math, 96 years, right? And also spending 4 years, you know, as governor, that so much of his time was in Plains, Georgia, right? And just, you know, being kind of a regular U.S. citizen, as much as a regular citizen can be post being a president. But I do think about the mark that he has done on such a significant state and significant, you know, part of the South.
No, you're right. You know, a couple of the things that have come through is that, you know, people are clearly proud of this global citizen that Jimmy Carter became and this global legend that he became, but they're also very proud of this legacy of public service that he left behind. And I think that's a big part of it's certainly been a big part of the memories here the last several days. And you know, you mentioned the size of Plains, Georgia. As you heard Andy Young mention during the funeral earlier today, Plains is so small, Andy Young wondered how could such a giant come from a place so small. And of course, Andy Young is a person who was a UN ambassador under Jimmy Carter, and also then later was the mayor of Atlanta here, and is really one of, at age 92, not just one of the people who's been close to Carter for much of his life, but one of the living legends of the civil rights movement.
Brett, you talk about the Carter Center being in Atlanta, and the former president spending so much of his life in the state of Georgia. What did it do for the state of Georgia to have a president come back and live in that place where he was from? What did it do for the town of Plains? In a world where you see so many former presidents, there aren't that many of them, but what they do post-presidency is oftentimes jet around the world giving speeches, high-profile events that end up paying them millions of dollars just for appearance fees. What is that like?
Well, yeah, no, I think it certainly is such a large part of the legacy that the former president left behind, that legacy of public service. And you're right. I mean, it comes across so clearly here in the state whenever people talk about the president, and we've heard a lot of that in recent days. You know, it's interesting that there in Plains, Roseland and Jimmy Carter really became the tourism industry for a number of years. You know, the town became an attraction because of their existence there. And, you know, now his body is headed there to be buried alongside the body of Roseland there on their property, along a pond that Jimmy himself helped build, and it's under a willow tree. And, you know, that property also includes a magnolia tree that was transplanted from the White House, from a sprout that Andrew Jackson actually planted a couple of 100 years ago. Wow. So that's on the property, and the Carters have deeded the property to the government, to the National Park Service, and so it will become a museum.
You know, I think about political life and politicians, and a New York politician is often different from a politician down south versus one on the West Coast. You know, whether it was Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or other individuals. And I know what is it about someone who, you know, grew up humbly, right? Or you know, a son of a peanut farmer. How many stories have we read that they didn't have running water or electricity for several years? But what is it about an individual coming from perhaps his background in the South in particular? And I know the South isn't all one big, you know, group, if you will. Each state or each southern state is a little bit different, but I do think about that and the impact that has also on an individual and maybe how they led.
Yeah, look, you know, if there's a consistent thread that runs through the lives of these presidents, we looked at the former presidents gathered today at the National Cathedral. One thing's for sure is that they all are tough and they all have persevered at different times in their lives, right? And you can probably, you know, pull out so many stories about so many different ones. And, you know, this president was clearly no different. You know, this extremely warm heart, this extremely compassionate sort of soul, but nonetheless, clearly an extraordinarily tough individual.
You know, Brett, we were just showing visuals for both our TV and our YouTube audience and our streaming audience, and it was a lot of Rosalynn Carter. And I feel like so much has also been said, yes, obviously, of Jimmy Carter, and understandably so. And we did see many former first ladies also at the Washington National Cathedral today, of former past presidents. But I think about the role, the two of them, right, that they worked together on so much inside the White House together, outside the White House together.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a tremendous reminder of what an extraordinary partnership the presidency really is, right? And they I think underscored that as much as any couple we've seen.
Hey, Brett, it's interesting, during Jimmy Carter's lifetime so much happened, but in the most recent couple of election cycles, we've seen the state of Georgia turn into this all-important swing state, this purple state that where politicians spend so much money and so much time. What would you say is the context of Georgia in today's political environment?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, the state really is evolving. I mean, this is one of the places, because of this tremendous influx of people here in this, you know, this Sun Belt state, where we're seeing tremendous change. Like I mentioned, the president's North Mountain cabin refuge. It's my understanding that where that's located is kind of an enclave of conservative Republicans. I mean, who would have ever thought it? And that's where Jimmy Carter would have settled for relaxation. But I think, again, it's an example of the extent to which this state is certainly evolving. And as you've pointed out, I mean, it's no given that it's going to go either way, right? We've been kind of teetering back and forth right now. The state house is controlled by Republicans, but both of our statewide candidates, both of our senators are Democrats. So it will continue to be an interesting place to watch.
You know, Brett, you're there in Atlanta this whole week, though, right? Started the memory and honoring of the former president started in Georgia, right, and then made its way, of course, to the nation's capital, D.C., and then, of course, returning back home. I am curious about conversations that you've been hearing in and around the week, maybe perhaps about the former president and just I don't know, you know, the honoring of him and what you've been seeing and hearing.
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, I can't say that I've been privy to any special conversations, but I do think that what we've seen publicly has been, you know, nothing but honorable. I think very much like what we saw in Washington earlier today, we saw these warring factions of politicians come together to honor this former president. It's been like that here. The Governor Brian Kemp joined with Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens and on the steps of the state capitol a few days ago and welcomed the Carter family when they arrived here with the casket. And so I think befitting the man, befitting the former president, it has been very dignified and very honorable.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Listen, Brett, thank you so much. And I agree with you. I think that was striking to so many of us. I even said that earlier, that to see the former presidents, former presidential candidates, you know, some won, some didn't get, you know, and then to see along, of course, with Donald Trump, the incoming president, and to see it so civil I found it a bit calming and reassuring in terms of our political system at work. Brett Pulley, he's Bloomberg News Atlanta Bureau Chief, joining us right there from Atlanta. We do want to continue kind of our progression across the United States and head back to the West Coast.
The president this afternoon is set to convene senior White House and administration officials for a briefing on the full federal response that he's directed to the wildfires across Los Angeles. We're going to update you with any comments. Additionally, our own Madison Mueller writing about air quality in California, Southern California specifically, and the index of the EPA's air quality index showing that LA's had an AQI of 185 as of 10 a.m., which means vulnerable people should avoid going outside for long periods of time. For an update on the ground in Los Angeles, we're joined once again by Sarah McGregor. She's Bloomberg National Team Managing Editor. She joins us from the West Coast. Sarah, good to see you again this afternoon. Air quality is something that we haven't touched on much this afternoon because so many people are thinking about their homes, whether or not they can stay in the Los Angeles area for the next few days, months, even perhaps longer as they work to rebuild. What's the air quality like right there for you?
So we are at technically unhealthy levels of air quality, which sounds pretty frightening. I know at the office they've distributed and sent to our homes K95 masks, which are something, you know, we thought we had put away after COVID. I think that when we had them for the spread of disease. But, you know, I think everyone right now is sort of thinking about their kids, I think, or people who have health issues and kind of wondering and sort of assessing now, I guess, at what point, you know, does the air quality become an issue here? I know we were talking to some folks on our green team who said, you know, a lot of these buildings that are burning have toxins in them, have carcinogenics. And so when a wildfire is burning, it's sort of a special category, I think, of unhealthy air as well.
You know, I hate to go to, you know, at this point, the focus is obviously making sure people are safe, making sure they're out of harm's way, and really ultimately getting these fires under control. But, you know, when we see these wildfires, Sarah, so much of it is also kind of understanding how it started. And we know climate change, drier conditions just exacerbates these fires and makes them that much more destructive. There is a report in the New York Times saying that a technology company that gets data from sensors that can track problems Grounds on the electrical grid says its system picked up some signs of distress on power lines near the start of the fires in the LA area. Again, we're starting to just get little reports from everyone, and I know our team too is also reporting, but that's going to be really important to kind of understand how this all started once again.
Absolutely. Investigators, I know, we do know for a fact are on the scene trying to look into what caused these. I mean, we do know that for the days ahead of this, we were being warned. It was 100-mile-per-hour winds in some areas that, these wind gusts in itself, it would just take a small spark because it is so dry here and there's been so little rain. It would just take a small spark to cause a major wildfire. So it seems like, those warnings actually did become reality. But I think trying to learn lessons, the climate's changing. Obviously, we have had in the Los Angeles area more years of dry weather than I can remember than actually wet weather. And so I think understanding how to improve those things, if, whether it was arson or something caused by a utility, we don't know yet, but we, being able to, I guess, have a lesson learned from this will be important.
As I mentioned at the top of our interview, Sarah, the president and vice president are set to meet with administration officials to get briefed on the full federal response that the president has directed to the wildfires in Los Angeles. What do you know about resources on the ground there? Not just water, getting to areas that need it, but also human power. Justin Trudeau tweeting that 250 firefighters are helping with the effort from Canada. San Francisco and other parts of the state have sent firefighters to help. What do we know about resources, person power, and the like?
I can only imagine the firefighters in the area right now, how exhausted they are, how hard they're working. There's obviously the two big fires going right now, but there's multiple smaller fires. And I think the Hollywood fire has been contained at this point, but just the amount of resources they had to pour into that, it's really unimaginable right now. They must just all be sort of running on adrenaline. And so that will be a big question, I think, as we head into the weekend, because there are supposed to be these wind gusts again, which again are this, a really big red flag for these fires of how we will man this, whether it's water resources or just human power. How, can these firefighters really go at this pace for the next week? It's a huge question. And I think, on the other side, what sort of federal resources will come, obviously, for the, for the emergency efforts, but as well as rebuilding.
I do also, it's something we talked about with you earlier, Sarah, so forgive me for asking it again, but I do know folks are tuning in perhaps at this later hour. Remind us of, what your commute was like getting in, what you're hearing. I know when we've got a snow day or some kind of something going on, we all kind of share our stories coming in. And I'm just curious what you heard, once you got to work this morning.
Yeah, no one in our office has been, we've all been touched by this, and we all have stories. There's people that we know whose houses have burnt to the ground, their whole communities have burnt to the ground. And so there's, I think, a really big groundswell of emotion right now, and people really just wanting to reach out to help, whether it's hosting someone on their couch or, lending a hand and trying to figure out how they can contribute to this. I know my 4-year-old son, there's a Taekwondo studio near our house, and there's 70 kids there right now because all the schools are closed that are hosting these kids. And so I think, that's the kind of attitude that people are taking. So, it's sort of all hands on deck. And I think this will be an effort that's going to take not just hours or days, but weeks and months. And I think everyone's sort of girding for that right now. You mentioned schools. When we last spoke to you, you mentioned hotels. When you mentioned those things, I think to myself, what about the people who work at these things, who run these things? And if they're able to actually be there so these things run smoothly, what do you know about LA schools, if they're going to be open tomorrow, when they will be open again, and the implications of that? We do know, we just got a notice through LAUSD and also the, Santa Monica School District and otherwise that the schools will be closed for the rest of the week. They've made that decision. And I think a lot of it has to do with air quality and the fact that officials have actually asked people to stay off the roads unless they're emergency personnel to keep those roadways open if needed. So I think there's a lot of considerations. I'm sure a lot of staff at some of these school districts, for example, are affected by this or know people affected. So the schools will be closed. They are saying they'll be reopened Monday. We'll see what happens over the weekend. All right. Well, stay safe, Sarah. And I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you
again in the future. Sarah McGregor out there in Los Angeles. We do want to remind everybody the NBA posted the LA Lakers home game against the Charlotte Hornets today. It's the second straight day game slated to be played in downtown Los Angeles has been postponed. The NHL's Los Angeles Kings were scheduled to host the Calgary Flames, last night, and that too, understandably so, was postponed. All right, you're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are continuing to check in on the wildfires out in Southern California. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here on Bloomberg Business Week. A second day of fierce fires as LA firefighters are battling to contain 5 major blazes, although we have heard and had some upbeat news. I feel like, I shouldn't say upbeat, but it does feel like we are starting to see the Sunset Fire has been contained. And so and maybe some situations that are not getting worse. But again, nothing is really, or I should say major battles are still not contained. So that's something that continues to be. And we're watching the weather, we're watching the winds, which just makes the situation much worse.
Another aspect of this story, it's something we talk about during any disaster, natural or otherwise, is the cost. And in this case, specifically the cost and impact on the insurance industry. Wildfires engulfing swaths of Los Angeles are expected to be one of the nation's costliest natural disasters. Insurers potentially incurring losses of more than $10 billion. Carol, we got a couple stories on that. First up, it's about the unprecedented test of the FAIR Plan. It's the state-sponsored insurer of last resort. We got Leslie Kaufman joining us. She's climate reporter for Bloomberg News. She joins us from New Jersey this afternoon. It's the so-called FAIR Plan. It's a state-sponsored insurer of last resort. Leslie, you write about it today. What is it? How does it work? And how is this such a big test for it?
Well, first of all, it's always good to be with you here, even though it's such a terrible story. The FAIR Plan is the state-backed plan, which means that when you cannot get private insurance, which is increasingly the case in places like Florida and California, which have been hard hit by natural disasters, you can go to the state, and the state will provide you a plan of last resort. The problem is a lot of people have ended up on those plans. The size of the FAIR Plan in terms of its exposure, should a catastrophe hit, has tripled since 2020. They now have nearly 500 billion in exposure. So they've got a lot of people who are counting on them to come through, but they've never faced a huge catastrophe like this at this size. They've grown so much in the last years that we haven't really tested how this system is going to work, this public system.
Well, it's interesting because we had Matthew Palazzolo on, and we're going to have him on again in just a few minutes. He's the Bloomberg intelligence analyst who covers insurance here.
Yeah.
And he reminded us that it's not necessarily something that's funded by taxpayers. Explain to us the structure of FAIR and who pays into it.
Well, it's very interesting who's going to pay this. So the insurers have to put money in. So it's some combination of the insurers and the policyholders. So the policyholders have to put money in, and the insurers in the state have to put money in a relationship to their percentage of the market. So if you have 20% of the market, you have to put 20% of the money in. So, but if there's a catastrophe over a certain amount, new clarifications from the Commissioner of Insurance in California says the first $2 billion will be split equally between insurers and policyholders in the state. So you say it's not taxpayers, but it is people who own insurance policies. That is most taxpayers.
Is it a good plan? And especially when we continue to see fires of such that we are seeing at this hour out on the West Coast in Southern California? Is it enough?
Well,
I guess I'm asking, is it ultimately going to be enough?
Well, that is the question everyone would like to know the answer of. We have built this plan, or California's built this plan. It's gotten very big. What we know, though they will not confirm this, is that they have roughly $2.5 billion in reinsurance. That is insurance for their insurance. So they can go to their own insurance and say, okay, $2.5 billion. We know they have a couple $100 million of cash. What else they have to pay claims, we do not know. If they exceed that, they are going to have to do a public assessment. The head of the plan has already testified to the California legislature that they are one big disaster away from having to do an assessment. So look, do I think that they will pay claims? I do. Do I think that it might come at a pretty steep cost to everyone in California? It seems possible.
So who ends up, if they have to do an assessment, who ends up paying for those homes to be rebuilt that were protected or insured by this plan?
Well, half of the money will come from insurance companies, and half of that money will come from policyholders of all types across the state. They could, in theory, put an assessment on every home and every auto in that state. And obviously that would not be popular, especially in California, which it does not like to be taxed, but they could do that as a way of funding this.
Yeah, I do think about, right, these are homes that are very expensive, very close to one another. This is something you write about, and that in the case of a fire, they're going to be very susceptible to any kind of breakout, if you will. It makes me just, Leslie, think about, okay, there are deniers still, maybe perhaps, of climate change or the impact or the costs, and we increasingly see the costs. And at some point, this is now, increasingly becoming problems maybe at the city level, the state level. Do you not rebuild there? Because if we don't deal with climate change and we continue to see wildfires, we're just going to keep repeating the same problems over and over again.
I think this is the ultimate question for us in the United States, all across the states. People like to live in some of these very beautiful coastal areas. Who can blame them? But climate change is happening a lot faster than any of us thought. We have a great deal of evidence being written about by my colleague Lauren Rosenthal that the warming ocean has greatly extended California's fire season, bringing it into the era when the Santa Ana winds, which usually come in winter, which is rainy season, exist. So now we have heavy winds and a fire season. It's going to be a recipe for disaster, not just this year, but going into the future for as long as we can see. So we have two questions, which is, do we want to keep figuring out how to live with fire, or do we want to retreat? And how much are we willing to pay to live to fire? And I think those are going to become big questions. Also hurricanes and the coast of Florida. These are things we're all going to have to wrestle with.
I got to say, if I'm a reinsurer, I'm going to be like, I'm out. I think increasingly you see everybody in the industry. Leslie, so appreciate it. Leslie Kaufman, climate reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us from New Jersey.
Well, for more on the insurance element of this story, let's bring back Matthew Palazzola, senior analyst for property and casualty insurance for Bloomberg Intelligence. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Matthew, as Leslie was talking about, insurance companies have had to adjust their own models to what's been happening in recent years, namely paying out more in claims in different parts of the country, including California, Florida as well. What are the changes that they've made to their business models moving forward?
Yeah, Tim, what you'll see, unfortunately, is them pulling back from a lot of these places. That's what happened in Florida, happening in California, Louisiana, Gulf states.
But you said that there's a distinction between pulling back because of risk and pulling back because of regulatory issues.
Sure. So I would say the pulling back because of risk may be a little bit overblown.
Because you can always price risk, right?
Exactly. So what these companies will say is, we can price for risk, we can't price for fraud, we can't price for regulatory difficulties. We were just talking about the FAIR Plan, right? Even the FAIR Plan, which is not a state fund, but it's a private the insurer of last resort, they were talking about trying to get rate increases from the state. And the state made the FAIR Plan increase their limits. So made them say, you need to insure higher values. And then when the FAIR Plan said, we need more price, the state said, no, you can't get as much as you want. So the private insurers see that and they leave. The FAIR Plan can't leave. But so that's what's happening a lot of the time, is really they're leaving. Another problem is they can't use more sophisticated models in California. So California is not letting them use wildfire risk in pricing the policies. So that's why you're seeing a lot of it move. I'm not going to say 100%, but it's a big driving force.
But that's what insurance companies do, right? They're constantly pricing risk, right? So, or why would they otherwise? Right, exactly.
And they'll always say that. They'll say we can price risk, we can't price these other things.
Is it good to be an insurer?
Yeah, sometimes. We were talking about homeowners insurance, and the homeowners insurance line of business has not been spectacularly profitable. Some companies do it well.
It's expensive enough.
Yeah, and even with it being expensive, Tim,
so I'm surprised.
They still lose money. That on average, the industry will lose money underwriting insurance. They will pay out more than they'll take in. They'll make money on investment income on the float to supplement it a little bit, but they'll pay out more.
Why is that? Is that because of fraud?
In some cases, yes. In Florida, that was a big deal in Florida, was fraud. You were having this thing called assignment of benefits, where you could assign your benefits to a contractor. The contractor would then go to the insurance company and say, we need a new roof, we needed this, we needed that. And then they would end up suing them, so that would push up the cost. So you have legal fees on top of it, which you weren't pricing for. So that's part of it. The rapid rise in construction costs, construction materials really didn't help through COVID either.
So, you know, whenever we have like kind of natural disasters, and we'll find out what was the cause ultimately, but as we talked with our Will Wade earlier, you know, having these drier conditions caused by climate change just exacerbates the fires that ultimately happen. But having said that, you know, I'm always thinking, who does pay for it? And there's insurance companies, but the government sometimes provides disaster aid, federal aid, and then I think about, you know, it lands on somebody's balance sheet. And I just wonder, is it getting to a point where it's all out of control? Like what you were seeing from an insurance perspective, is it getting to that kind of tipping point?
For insurance companies, I would say no, right? So even if you said this is a $12 billion or $15 billion insured loss event, which would mean the economic losses would be multiples of that. Insurance companies, it would be an earnings event in the first quarter, not even that dramatic. So like, for example, Hurricane Helene was, call it like $11 or $12 billion loss in the third quarter, the hurricane in Florida.
Yeah.
And a lot of the insurers that I cover actually saw their earnings increase year over year, so they can absorb these things.
So they're raising prices somewhere.
But can they?
Or what? Is that the answer? Or
it's not that their capital positions are strong enough that they expect, like we were saying, they're in the business of risk. When we have models for these companies, we have catastrophe losses in them. There's a certain amount built in. This could be higher, but we know things like this happen.
Can they absorb in one quarter Helene and then the next quarter or the quarter after that absorb what's happening in California?
Events,
right? Yeah, no, so you're 100% right. The frequency of events that happened in prior years, frequency of kind of smaller events is a big deal. So if you had one major event, two major events in a year, or called two major events in a year, then a couple of minor events, but that added up in the next year, that would start to dent capital positions. Tim, you're right. But overall, the position is pretty strong.
The fires are not out yet. And I know we put out these like, you know, $10 billion maybe in losses. Could it be a lot more?
I think it could be a lot more. I mean, what surprised me, caught me off guard yesterday, was how many structures were destroyed so quickly. So there was the fire department saying 1,000 structures. We're talking all these numbers.
Yeah.
And that's like half of a major thing, and a major fire, and that was before it was contained at all. Wow.
And that's what I remember somebody saying to us yesterday, too. Maybe it was from our team out on the West Coast that, you know, when we were talking to them yesterday, they're saying 24 hours ago, we weren't really even talking about this. And then just the rapidity of everything that happened. Matt, thank you so much. We've leaned on you a lot today. Thank you. Matthew Palazzola, he's Senior Analyst of Property and Casualty Insurance for our Bloomberg Intelligence team, joining us right in studio. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser, Tim Stenovec. We are live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals on this Thursday, January 9th. We should point out that the Carter family and friends are now at Maranatha Baptist Church. A private funeral service is taking place. That church where former President Carter taught Sunday school for many years. After this service, this private service, the motorcade is expected to travel to the Carter home where his wife Rosalind is buried. The Navy is expected to conduct a ceremonial flyover, another tribute to Carter's service, both as lieutenant and commander-in-chief. And then Carter will finally be buried alongside his wife again in a private service. But we will continue to monitor, again, the rememberings of this 39th President of the United States.
We spent a lot of time today thinking about and talking about the life and legacy of the former president, hearing about his 4 years in office and then his many years of service following his time in the White House. One theme that has come up is how he was different than other presidents in a lot of ways, but politically and potentially to his detriment. He didn't necessarily play the political games that a lot of modern presidents and modern politics requires to get some things done. He even faced resistance during his presidency from within his own party as a result. Understanding presidents and their decisions is what Gautam Mukunda does. He's lecturer of management at Yale School of Management. He's author of the book, Picking Presidents, How to Make the Most Consequential Decisions in the World. He joins us this afternoon. Professor, I'm wondering how you would characterize President Carter's decision-making during his time in office.
So it was clearly different, and it was different in ways that sometimes benefited the country and sort of hurt his own political prospects, and sometimes it just didn't work out as well as it could have. But he was unique, and it's important to remember that he does not he was not a president who sort of blended into the background of other presidents. And just because he was a one-termer, we kind of forget just how impactful he was. On the upside, for example, he negotiated the Camp David Accords by personally being in Camp David for, I think it was 12 to 14 days with the leaders of Egypt and Israel, spending full time as President of the United States mediating that. It's essentially impossible to imagine any other president doing something like that. Just go ahead.
No, it's interesting. In one of our earlier discussions, I thought I heard someone say that there were like 20 drafts that he had helped create, and he went back and forth between the two camps while at Camp David, just, trying to work to make sure that something could get done.
Yeah, it's both this combination of his focus on making peace, which was remarkable, but also and I think this was sort of more Jimmy Carter than anything else, the giving up of ego, right? He was the most powerful person in the world, and he was not above essentially running back and forth between the leaders of two countries, both of which combined were the size of sort of a medium-sized American state, until they got to an agreement, if that's what it took. And the agreement that he forged has stuck.
So what was his motivation there?
So with most politicians, the easiest motivation is always the most cynical one. But with Jimmy Carter, that just doesn't work. Whatever else you might say about him, and I criticize him and praise him both in my books, but whatever else you can say about him, that man did not have a cynical bone in his body. It just doesn't seem to be been part of his personality. I think his motivation was that he really, really wanted to bring peace to the Middle East, and he thought it was the most important thing he could do.
I feel like, man, we could do some great debate on this. Was he a good leader? Was he a good president?
Oh, that is a wonderful debate. So I would say we remember him better than he was at the time, and not just because of his extraordinary post-presidential life and how admirable it was. There are real achievements during his presidency. The Camp David Accords are one of them, but the devil that destroyed his re-election was inflation. We usually give credit to taming inflation to Paul Volcker, the Fed chair that he appointed, knowing that Volcker would take measures that would hurt him politically, but that might be good for the country. That's a pretty big achievement. On the flip side, I think he really was hurt, and profoundly hurt, by the same outsider status that made him so special. He'd only had one term as governor from Georgia. He had never spent time in the federal government. He just didn't know how it worked, and that showed. There was one characteristic of the Carter administration that was consistently negative. It was managerial failure. He just was not good at getting the federal government to work, however much he cared about it. The most famous example of this, and just the extent to which his sort of micromanaging tendencies took over, is when Jimmy Carter was president. If you wanted to play on the White House tennis courts, you had to get his personal approval.
Why do you think that is?
He was managing the calendar. Yeah, he was managing the calendar for the White House tennis courts.
Not a job a typical president does, and one necessary, and something that perhaps shows a challenge of delegating.
So partly a challenge in delegating, but so I talked to a member of his administration about this once because it seemed so insane. And he explained to me that it was essentially a consequence of sort of the larger political fissures within the administration kind of materializing and growing around and sort of focusing in on this particular problem. But that is not an explanation that actually makes it worse, right? Because it says that he allowed those kinds of political debates within his own White House to become so severe that he ended up having to intervene in this frankly ridiculous way. Again, this is sort of a consequence. You wonder if he might have done better if he had, say, a term in the Senate or 2 terms in Congress just to get to know the government.
We have to unfortunately interrupt. Gautam Mukunda, of course, over at Yale School of Management. We do want to take you to the White House, though. President Biden speaking about the wildfires out on the West Coast.
We're increasing it to 100% of all the costs to be covered by the federal government for both the fire management assistance grants and the elements of what they call the disaster declaration. So today I'm announcing that the federal government will cover 100% of the cost for 180 days. This is going to pay for things like debris and hazard material removal, temporary shelters, first responders' salaries, and all necessary measures to protect life and property. And folks, I want to underscore, I told the governor and local officials, spare no expense to do what they need to do and contain these fires and in their communities that have really been devastating. And we're doing literally everything we can at a federal level. That's also why I call this group of folks around this table of all relevant federal departments and agencies together to discuss what more we can do. And some of the folks are on the screen as well. Before we begin things, here's an update on where things stand right now. First, we're focused on helping contain these fires. Over the last 24 hours, the United States Forest Service, working with state and local responders, has suppressed over 50 fire starts. And the fire in the Hollywood Hills has been contained by brave firefighters risking their lives. Right now, 3 major fires are still burning in the Pacific Palisades, in Pasadena, and in Sylmar. I want to be clear. What I know from talking to the governor, that there are concerns out there that there's also been a water shortage. The fact is, the utilities understandably shut off power because they're worried the lines that they carried energy were going to be blown down and spark additional fires. But the Cal Fire, when it did that, it cut off the ability to generate pumping the water. That's what caused the lack of water in these hydrants. And so Cal Fire is bringing in generators to get these pumps up and working again so that there's no longer a shortage of water coming out of these hydrants. I'm also surging all federal resources possible to Southern California, including 400 additional federal firefighters, over 30 firefighting helicopters and planes, federally supplied, firefighting planes and helicopters, and 8 Department of Defense C-130s that are equipped to suppress wildfires. Today, the Secretary of Defense also authorized 500 wildfire ground clearing personnel from the Defense Department. And I've directed the department to continue working with Governor Newsom to identify additional resources that can be provided for public safety and security. And we've secured additional firefighters and firefighting aircraft from our ally in Canada as well. I also want everyone in Southern California to know we're going to keep at it. We're sticking with this. We expect there may be a temporary break in the winds, but in some areas the winds are likely to continue well into next week. And so we're going to continue to sending everything, literally, every resource we can find that's appropriate to help the governor and the first responders. Second, we're focused on helping people who have been displaced or in many cases lost everything. You reported on, you've seen the homes just burned to the ground, whole areas burned to the ground, large areas. They've been displaced and they've lost everything. As I said, since the fire started, FEMA has been working with the state to help residents get shelter, groceries, prescriptions, and other critical goods like baby formula. We're also sent FEMA Director Criswell to Los Angeles to manage our response on the ground. She was supposed to be on this call, but we have the deputy here because she is out in the field with the governor right now, surveying what's going on. Let me close with a message to the people of Southern California. We are with you. We're not going anywhere. To the firefighters and first responders, you are heroes. Many of these firefighters are out there risking their lives, and some, well, I won't go beyond that, but risking their lives, and while their own homes are in danger, their families are in danger. To the firefighters and first responders, you really are, it's not hyperbole, you're heroes. You're genuinely heroes. And the worst, this is the most widespread, devastating fire in California's history. It's amazing. And there's nobody understands it better than the press. Have been covering this on a minute-to-minute basis. And you literally have to run into the flames, these firefighters. You know, that old expression, God made man, then he made a few firefighters. Who runs into flames? You know, in doing so, you're leaving your own families and who may be in harm's way as well. So we owe you. And we're going to make sure that you get every resource you need, every possible resource you need. You know, to the families who have been impacted by this disaster, you're living through a nightmare, I know. And I promise you, we're going to help you get through this and eventually recover and rebuild. I want to turn it over now to the Vice President before we go on to the folks in the various cabinet positions as well as agencies that control these issues. Madam Vice President, I know you're directly affected, so you fire away. No pun intended.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. President, and also for the work that everyone around this table has been doing with the appropriate sense of urgency, because this is an urgent matter. What we have seen in California, and in particular in Southern California, is apocalyptic in terms of the nature of it and the unprecedented nature of it as well. And what we are seeing is a situation that is extremely dynamic. It is very much in play, and to some degree unpredictable, because we are literally waiting to see which way the wind blows. And I cannot praise enough the local leaders, most of whom I have talked with, and in particular our firefighters, who, as the President has said, they are working around the clock. They are working 12-hour, even longer shifts, and they are doing it with a sense of optimism, but also with an understanding of how serious this moment is and how important their work is to real lives and real people. Thousands of families have been displaced. Many of those families with young children with nowhere to go. And what we know is that this is a matter of current urgency, but this is also something that is going to have an impact for months and years to come. And on that point, I will also make note of the fact that, sadly, many insurance companies have canceled insurance for a lot of the families who have been affected and will be affected, which is only going to delay or place an added burden on their ability to recover. And I think that is an important point that must be raised, and hopefully there can be some way to address that issue, because these families, so many of them, otherwise will not have the resources to recover in any meaningful way. And many of them have lost everything. In the midst, however, of all of the trauma that has occurred, we have seen extraordinary acts of heroism. I'm hearing countless stories of strangers helping strangers. People who are opening their homes where they are intact and have not had to evacuate, opening their homes to neighbors, to friends of neighbors, feeding them and providing shelter for them. And I do think that it speaks to the best of who we are as a country, which is in times of crisis, we find the heroes among us who we may not have known before, but act out of a sense of courage, but also a sense of community. And I applaud all those who are approaching this crisis with that spirit. And the bottom line is this: there are incredible heroes every day who are working right now in California on the front lines of this fire. And in particular, I want to thank the firefighters for all they are doing. They are, as the president said, putting themselves in harm's way, and they are doing the work that is about helping people who are perfect strangers to them and doing it in some of the highest moments of need that anyone could face. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz Sherwood-Randall.
Turn it back to me.
Okay, back to the president.
Look, I've had a chance to speak with a lot of the elected officials, including the senators, some of the congresspersons in the region, as well as the vice president as well. And I want to be clear that one of the reasons I've asked this larger group to get together is because they control the very agencies that are needed from the federal level to get things done. And we're in a situation where the U.S. Forest Service Chief, Randy Moore, is here. And he's going to provide an update in the fire situation in Los Angeles and discuss how the U.S. Fire Service, the U.S. Forest Service, is assisting Los Angeles and the state of California with fighting the wildfire, including the action his team has taken to suppress new fire starts. So, Chief, why don't you fire away?
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Vice President. It's great to see you. I, too, consider California my home.
Yes.
And so it's great to be here to talk about this dramatic situation that we have. So the Forest Service and the Department of Interior are actively engaged in supporting the response to the wildfires in Southern California. And there are 4 major fires that we currently have going on. The Forest Service is in unified command with the LA County as well as other local city agencies. We're looking at the Eaton, the Hearst, and the Lydia. And if you look at that area there, that's the northernmost part of that area where the fires have taken place. The Palisades Fire, which CAL FIRE is in control of. And then we have a new start, which is this Sundown Fire that just started last night. And it also has the potential to expand quite significantly just based on the location it's at, but also the winds that are expected to continue. Right now, when I look at the mutual aid system in California, I want you to know that it's second to none in terms of how that system works and how it really moves to activate the federal firefighting community and how it is activated and engaged. You know, every year we prepare for these Santa Ana winds. It's just that what is happening now is happening sooner. It's happening at a time now where we normally are at our lowest point in the fire year. And the fact that these fires are taking place now, it says that there are things that are going on in our climate that is creating truly year-round fire situations, and it's something that we all need to be mindful of, and this is a good indication of that. To give you an example, if a fire starts from any ignition source during these Santa Ana winds, it has the potential for explosive growth and spread. And when that happens under these wind-driven conditions, it's very difficult to control. Now, in addition to this, when these winds are high, the aviation resources cannot fly. So it limits a lot of the potential area of support. As of this morning, there were over 4,000 firefighters that were assigned to these large fires. 600 or so were currently federal work, which means Forest Service and Department of Interior. And it doesn't include many who are assigned to their home units to provide initial attack. To give you an idea of the unsung heroes in these fire type conditions, in the last 24 hours, we've had 50 starts. And the initial attack success has been wonderful. So we've stopped the potential for 50 additional fires to be added to these 4 significant fires that